March 11th, 3 a.m. Tel Aviv. Outside, it's the longest missile night of the war. You can hear the distant thuds of intercepts, then the oppressive silence that hangs between sirens. Inside a cramped bomb shelter, the air is thick with a shared, unspoken fear. Then a sound cuts through it, not an explosion, not a government alert, a single, jarringly personal ping. A phone screen lights up, its glow the only light in the room. The message isn't from their own government, it's from the enemy, signed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It reads, "Your government is lying to you. Missiles are on their way. No shelter can keep you safe." In that instant, the concrete walls become irrelevant. The real attack had bypassed every physical defense, aimed directly at the trust holding their world together. But this was a deliberate escalation. To grasp why this single message signals such a terrifying new phase, you first have to understand the brutal but predictable rules that had just been broken. These weren't rules of engagement written in some treaty. They were etched into the daily routine of a society under siege. For months, the conflict had settled into a grim pattern of attrition. A war fought not in decisive battles, but in a slow, grinding erosion of the human will to endure. Life, against all odds, continued, but it was a life lived in the shadow of constant, low-grade anxiety. You'd see people on their way to work carefully stepping over the rubble from last night's strike as if it were just a puddle. You'd see children in playgrounds who no longer flinched at the sound of a distant explosion. That was the real cost, the normalization of chaos. The air raid sirens had become a constant, almost ignored, background noise. There were, as one report noted, so many sirens that people simply stopped counting. The sound was no longer a sharp cry of immediate danger, but the dull, humming soundtrack to a national burnout. The population's psychological response systems were overloaded, numbed. This was the baseline. A people already pushed to their absolute breaking point, convinced that the war, as terrible as it was, couldn't possibly get any worse. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The catalyst for that shift, the event that truly broke the old rules of the war, had actually appeared 3 days before. Those text messages ever reached a single phone in Tel Aviv? On March 8th, Iranian state media made an announcement. They had a new supreme leader, a man named Moshaba Kamani. And instantly, in quiet rooms from Langley to London, analysts were running his name against every classified database, every human intelligence source, every leaked government file. The result was a deafening digital silence. 0 results. The global intelligence apparatus, a system designed to know everything, had just encountered a perfect void. Think about the structure here. In a theocracy run by clerics, in a state protected by generals whose careers are public record, a complete unknown was suddenly handed control of the most powerful missile arsenal in the Middle East, and he inherited a war that he did not start. The immediate question, echoing in the war rooms of Washington and Tel Aviv, wasn't the usual, "What will he do next?" It was something far more fundamental, far more chilling. Where did he come from? Who were his allies? And what was the true source of his sudden absolute power? All of their worst-case scenarios, all their predictive models, were suddenly worthless. They were all asking the one question that mattered. Who is Moshaba Kamani? The answer was going to be more terrifying than anyone's darkest imagination. That terrifying answer, it didn't stay hidden for long. In fact, the mystery of the digital ghost, Moshaba Kamani, was solved with chilling speed. But the truth? When it finally broke through the static, it didn't bring clarity. It didn't bring relief. It brought a pure cold terror. You see, the global intelligence apparatus was looking for the wrong kind of man. They were searching for a political strategist, a military hawk, a religious ideologue. They found none of that. Khamenei's ascent to power, his iron grip on the state, wasn't driven by any grand design for the future of Iran. It was driven by a single, horrific event in the past. On the very first day of the war, a US-Israeli joint airstrike hit a residential building. A detail lost in the noise of the initial chaos. Inside that building was Khamenei's entire close family. His mother, his wife, his son, his sister, his niece, his nephew, and his brother-in-law, all of them, gone in a single flash. That was the inflection point. The moment the entire logic of this conflict recalibrated. This was no longer a geopolitical chess match. For the man who now controlled Iran, the war had become a personal, unrestrained vendetta. A man who had lost everything now held the command authority over the largest and most advanced missile arsenal in the entire Middle East. And this raises a deeply unsettling question. When a leader, driven by such an immense and absolute personal tragedy, has nothing left to lose, do the old rules of strategic deterrence even apply? I'm genuinely interested to hear your analysis in the comments. We now understood the why. We understood the engine of rage that was now at the helm. But what we were about to see was his very first command. The first physical expression of that rage. And it wasn't a strategic move. It was a message written in fire. That message had a number. 1 metric ton. That was Khamenei's first order as supreme leader. It wasn't about a specific target or a complex maneuver. It was a change in physics. He commanded that all future missiles fired at Israel must carry a warhead with a minimum weight of 1 metric ton. To understand what that means, you have to remember what came before. The missile that had previously destroyed a reinforced underground shelter. The one that killed 9 people huddled inside. That used a 500-kilogram warhead. Half a ton. And it was already devastating. Khamenei's new baseline was double that. But he didn't stop there. The attack on March 11th, the night of the psychological terror texts, used warheads that were 2 tons each, 4 times the destructive power. This wasn't a calculation for military advantage. This was rage, given a payload and a target. It was designed for maximum destruction and maximum fear. Any shelter that gave a family a sense of safety before, it was now just a tomb. This is the direct translation of personal grief into military doctrine, and the commander of the aerospace force even announced it publicly. The policy was for maximum damage and fear. They weren't hiding it. Because the gap between personal vengeance and strategic discipline, that is precisely where wars become uncontrollable. But here's the thing about those 2-ton warheads, the sheer physical destruction they represent. It's a distraction, a terrifying, ground-shaking distraction. The real war, the one that will truly define the next phase of this conflict, is being fought in a different dimension entirely. That dimension is the war for trust, a conflict fought not with explosives, but with perception. It's not a sideshow. It is the war inside the war. This was a bi-directional battle. While Iran was sending psychologically disruptive texts to Israeli phones, Israel's own cyber units were launching parallel operations. Early in the conflict, they targeted Badi Saba, a popular Iranian prayer and calendar app. With over 5 million users, they hacked its notification system, pushing messages directly to Iranian citizens, messages promising that help is on the way, urging military personnel to abandon their posts. On the surface, both sides failed. There were no mass defections in Iran, no widespread surrender in Israel. But this misses the point. The primary objective was a feint. The true devastating impact was a secondary effect. The creation of a total trust vacuum. Citizens on both sides, Iranian and Israeli, were systematically taught to distrust every source of information. Their government's official statements, the enemy's broadcasts, even the alerts on their own phones. Pause here. This is the single most important pivot in this entire analysis. Because this trust vacuum isn't a political science concept. It's a new invisible volatility driver. When trust in information dies, the market's core pricing engine breaks. And what happens next is how capital gets vaporized by threats that don't show up on a spreadsheet. This is where the risk moves from the battlefield directly to your balance sheet. This narrative fog, born from governments losing control of the information space, creates persistent geopolitical risk premiums. According to analysis from institutions like JP Morgan's private bank, this isn't a temporary spike. It becomes a permanent feature embedded in oil futures and equities, forcing a long-term reallocation of capital towards hard assets as a defense. This psychological layer also intersects directly with behavioral finance. As research published in Finance Research Letters has demonstrated, wartime narratives, especially those fueled by powerful emotions like revenge, are potent triggers for investor herding. They drive capital flows based on story, not fundamentals, leading to severe, narrative-driven mispricing. Suddenly, the authenticity of information is no longer a soft factor for the media to debate. It becomes a market fundamental, as critical to your portfolio's health as a physical supply chain. But this isn't just a theory. This dynamic of a leader's narrative being weaponized and dismantled in real time has already played out at the highest levels of global power with profound consequences. Next, we'll examine the most telling case study of all, one that demonstrates precisely how this new form of warfare operates and why no one is immune. As the conflict spiraled, the disconnect between the official Western narrative and the battlefield reality became a chasm. The emperor, you could say, had no clothes, and Iran was pointing it out with missiles. The most glaring example of this came from the top. President Trump repeatedly downplayed the severity of the war. In public statements, he dismissed it as a short-term excursion, a little excursion that he assured everyone will end soon. The official line was calm, dismissive, projecting total control. Iran seized on this credibility gap. Immediately following one of those optimistic statements, they gave their answer. Not with a press release, but with a massive, 3-hour-long missile barrage against US and Israeli targets. 3 hours. Think about that. This wasn't a token shot. It was a sustained, deliberate, and very public act of defiance. This was not just a military action. It was a real-time refutation. A piece of performance art using firepower. Iran was using its military to prove that the American government had lost control of the narrative. If you've ever had that feeling, that what you're being told by official sources and what you know in your gut to be real are two different things. This was that feeling, weaponized on a global scale. This is the trust corrosion that creates permanent systemic risk. But is this pattern of a great power losing control of its own story, of an insurgent force using the truth as its most potent weapon, is any of this truly new? To understand the endgame of this kind of psychological warfare, we have to look back. We have to look at one of the most legendary insurgent campaigns in history. We have to talk about Geronimo. His name was Geronimo. And in the spring of 1858, in a quiet camp in northern Mexico, his world ended.
While he was away on a trading trip, Mexican soldiers attacked. They slaughtered his elderly mother, his young wife, and his 3 small children. When he returned, he found only silence and bodies. In that moment, a peaceful family man died, and a relentless instrument of war was born. As he later said, "I was like a wild animal. I vowed vengeance upon the Mexican troopers who had killed my loved ones, and I kept my vow." For the next 30 years, Geronimo led a tiny band of Apache warriors, sometimes no more than 30 men, against the full might of both the Mexican and United States armies. He understood he could never win a conventional war, so he perfected a psychological one. His strategy was not to conquer territory, but to conquer the minds of his enemies. Through lightning-fast raids on isolated settlements, he created a state of constant, unbearable terror across the entire frontier. The United States Army deployed over 5,000 troops, a quarter of its entire strength, and spent millions of dollars hunting him. And for years they could not stop him. He held 2 nations hostage, not with an army, but with the sheer force of a single implacable will. Geronimo's story is a timeless lesson in power dynamics. It teaches us that a superior military force is at its most vulnerable when it faces an enemy who has nothing left to lose, an enemy driven by a grief that no treaty can appease, and a desire for vengeance that no threat can deter. Now look at today. The Apache Lightning Raid is Moshaba Kamani's text message campaign. The US Army's frustration on the frontier is the Pentagon's frustration in the Strait of Hormuz. The core dynamic, the paralysis of a superpower by one man's grief, is identical. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does provide a blueprint. And Geronimo's story is the blueprint for what happens when a man with a bottomless capacity for grief gets his hands on a weapon. But this time, the weapon isn't a rifle. It's an arsenal of ballistic missiles. And that brings us to the grim reality of today, a strategic stalemate. America and its allies can win battles. They can destroy missile launchers. They can sink ships in the Red Sea. But they cannot win this war, because their opponent is playing an entirely different game. Under Khamenei, Iran has no interest in a diplomatic off-ramp. There are no negotiations to be had. Their military factories are running 24/7. The IRGC has publicly declared full readiness for a long-term war of attrition, stating they have the capacity to sustain this conflict for months or even years. Their victory condition isn't capturing territory. It is economic and psychological exhaustion. It is attrition. For the West, there is no clear military end state. You cannot deter an enemy whose motive cannot be satisfied with strategic concessions. The Geronimo blueprint taught us this. You cannot reason with a man who has already lost everything he valued. All you can do is react. This is the synthesis of everything we've seen. The psychological terror, the deep-seated revenge, the information vacuum, all culminating in this new reality, the infinite war. It's a cycle of revenge with no exit. As one analyst put it, the gap between personal vengeance and strategic discipline. That is precisely where wars become uncontrollable. That gap is no longer a risk. It is now the central feature of this conflict, creating long-term, systemic risk for the entire global economy. The key takeaway for navigating this landscape is therefore clear. The most dangerous variable is not the one you can see on a satellite photo. It's not the ship, not the missile count. It's the one you can't see. The resolve of a man with nothing left to lose and a world to avenge. If this framework for understanding the invisible risks in today's world is valuable to you, Subscribe for more analysis that goes beyond the headlines. I'm keen to hear your biggest takeaway in the comments below.